And so I need to give you a massive flashing red warning here. What I'm about to say is quite disturbing. There's a lot of uncomfortable language. And if you are triggered or upset by sex assaults and violent assaults, etc., then this is definitely not the show for you tonight.
It began like any other job for Malcolm Greaves, a seasoned contractor known for his expertise in unusual and high-profile construction projects. Over the years, he had built panic rooms for billionaires, hidden vaults for art collectors, and even underground sanctuaries for celebrities. But when the call came in about a new project for Sean "Diddy" Combs, the hip-hop mogul and music legend, Malcolm felt a flicker of excitement. This wasn't just another commission. It was the kind of job that came with an aura of mystery. Before we start, smash the like and subscribe buttons for more updates. The instructions were as cryptic as the project itself. The client wanted an intricate network of underground tunnels built beneath a sprawling estate in Miami. The purpose? Confidential. The design? To be made with the utmost discretion, ensuring the tunnels were invisible to the casual observer. To Malcolm, secrecy wasn't unusual in his line of work. What made this project stand out was the sheer scale and complexity of the plans. The network was vast, with intersections, dead ends, and chambers that felt more like catacombs than simple pathways. Malcolm assembled his team of trusted workers, men who had proven their loyalty over years of sensitive projects. Together, they traveled to the site, a secluded property surrounded by tall hedges and patrolled by private security. Even before breaking ground, the place had an oppressive atmosphere. The sprawling mansion loomed above, its walls an imposing mix of glass and concrete that gleamed under the Miami sun. It felt less like a home and more like a fortress. From the start, something felt off. The blueprints provided by Diddy's representatives were intricate, but strangely devoid of practical purpose. There were no clear indications of why the tunnels were being built. No storage spaces, no clear exits. Malcolm assumed they were meant for security reasons, maybe a way to escape unnoticed in case of an emergency. Still, the lack of clarity nagged at him. The digging began without much fanfare. The team worked in shifts, excavating the earth and reinforcing the tunnels with steel and concrete. As the days turned into weeks, Malcolm noticed peculiar details about the project. For one, the soil was unusually damp, despite no nearby bodies of water. At times, the air underground carried a metallic tang, as if rusted iron permeated the space. Some of the workers joked about it being haunted, but Malcolm dismissed their chatter. Tunnels, especially ones this deep, always had a way of playing tricks on the mind. But the strangeness didn't stop there. One evening, as Malcolm stayed behind to review the plans, he thought he heard faint whispers echoing from the freshly dug passageways. It wasn't the muffled chatter of his workers, but something softer, almost like a murmur carried on a breeze. When he went to investigate, flashlight in hand, he found nothing, just the stillness of an unfinished tunnel. He shook it off as exhaustion. As the project neared its midway point, the incidents grew more frequent. Tools disappeared, only to be found later in places no one remembered leaving them. Workers reported hearing footsteps when no one else was around. One man even claimed to have seen a shadowy figure darting through the tunnels. He quit the next day, refusing to return despite Malcolm's pleas. Then came the discovery that changed everything. It was a routine dig. Malcolm and his team were carving out a new chamber when one of the workers' shovels struck something solid. At first, they thought it was a buried rock, but as they cleared away the dirt, it became evident this was no natural formation. A slab of dark stone emerged, etched with symbols Malcolm didn't recognize. Intrigued, he called in an archaeologist he had worked with in the past, hoping for a quick explanation. The expert arrived the next morning, a wiry man with glasses named Dr. Franklin Wade. He examined the stone with growing unease. "These symbols aren't modern," he said, tracing the carvings with his gloved hand. "They're pre-Columbian, possibly tied to local indigenous tribes. But this," he pointed to a particular motif resembling an eye surrounded by jagged lines. "I've never seen anything like it. This isn't just decorative, it's a warning." Malcolm didn't like the sound of that. Diddy's representatives, however, were adamant that the project continue. When Malcolm informed them of the discovery, they simply ordered the slab to be removed and the chamber completed as planned. Reluctantly, Malcolm complied. though he couldn't shake the feeling that they were tampering with something they didn't understand. The nights grew worse. Malcolm began having vivid nightmares of being trapped underground, suffocated by collapsing walls. His workers grew increasingly on edge, muttering about cursed ground and unnatural occurrences. One night, a foreman named Luis was found wandering the tunnels in a daze, muttering incoherently about eyes in the dark. He had no memory of how he got there. The climax came 2 weeks later. Malcolm was inspecting one of the finished sections when he noticed something peculiar, a faint rhythmic vibration coming from the walls. He pressed his ear against the cold concrete and froze. It sounded like a heartbeat, steady and deliberate. The sensation was so unnerving that he stumbled back, his flashlight clattering to the ground, and then he saw it. At the far end of the tunnel, where the light barely reached, a figure stood. It was tall, its silhouette humanoid, but wrong. Its limbs were too long, its head too angular. Malcolm blinked, and the figure was gone, leaving him questioning his sanity. He decided to confront Diddy's representatives, demanding answers. But when he tried to explain what he'd seen, they brushed him off, their expressions unreadable. "Finish the job," was all they said, their voices devoid of concern. Desperate for clarity, Malcolm turned to Dr. Wade again, sharing everything that had transpired. The archaeologist listened intently, his face pale. "You need to stop," Wade said. "Those symbols weren't just a warning, they're a seal. Whatever you're digging into, it wasn't meant to be disturbed." Malcolm wanted to heed the advice, but he felt trapped. The money, the contracts, the threats from Diddy's team if he abandoned the project, it all weighed on him. Against his better judgment, he continued. The final chamber was the worst. As the team broke through the last layer of soil, they uncovered a cavern unlike anything they'd seen before. The walls were lined with more of the strange symbols, glowing faintly in the dim light. At the center of the cavern was a stone altar, slick with a substance Malcolm hoped wasn't blood. The air was suffocating, filled with a low hum that vibrated through their bones, and then the ground began to shake. It wasn't an earthquake, it was something far more localized, as if the earth itself were alive and angry. The workers fled, abandoning their tools as cracks spiderwebbed across the walls. Malcolm barely made it out, his heart pounding as the tunnel collapsed behind him. The project was halted indefinitely. Diddy's team declared the site unsafe and sealed it off. Malcolm received his payment, but it felt more like blood money. He couldn't shake the memories of what he'd seen, or the feeling that something had been left unfinished. In the years that followed, rumors swirled about the estate. Some claimed it was haunted, others that it housed something far darker. Diddy himself never spoke of the tunnels, and the property remained shrouded in secrecy. As for Malcolm, he left the construction business altogether, haunted by the knowledge that he had unearthed something that should have stayed buried. And late at night, when the world was quiet, he sometimes thought he could hear it. The faint, rhythmic beating of a heart beneath the ground, growing louder with every passing year. Malcolm's life after the Miami project was a shadow of its former self. He returned home to Atlanta, determined to leave behind the strange events that had plagued him. For weeks, he avoided calls from friends, family, and former colleagues, retreating into the safety of his modest suburban home. Yet, no matter how much he tried to put the past behind him, the memories of that cavern, the whispers in the tunnels, and the thing he'd seen at the far end of the corridor refused to let him go. He began having vivid nightmares that felt more like intrusions than dreams. In one, he was back in the tunnels, walking their length as the walls pulsed and bled. A deep voice, not entirely human, called his name from the darkness, beckoning him to return. In another dream, he was trapped beneath the ground, the earth pressing in on him as unseen hands clawed at his skin. Every night, the dreams grew more elaborate, more visceral, and more terrifying. Worse still were the waking hallucinations. At first, they were subtle, a shadow moving in his peripheral vision, faint echoes in the quiet of his home. But soon, they escalated. On more than one occasion, he saw the figure from the tunnel, its elongated limbs and angular head watching him from a corner or through a window. By the time he turned to face it, the apparition was gone, leaving Malcolm trembling and drenched in sweat. Desperate for answers, Malcolm began researching the symbols that had been carved into the stone slab and the cavern walls. His internet searches turned up little, mostly vague references to pre-Columbian art and indigenous South American rituals. Frustrated, he turned to academic sources, sifting through obscure journals and university publications. It wasn't until he stumbled across a forum dedicated to esoteric archaeology that he found a lead. One user, going by the handle Obsidian Dreamer, claimed to have knowledge of similar symbols found in hidden sites across the Americas. According to their posts, these symbols were tied to an ancient cult predating recorded history. The cult, they said, worshipped entities known as the Buried Ones, beings that were neither gods nor demons but something in between. These entities were believed to be asleep beneath the earth, bound by powerful seals to prevent their awakening. Malcolm reached out to the user, explaining what he'd seen and asking for more information. Days passed without a response, and Malcolm began to think he'd hit another dead end. Then, late one night, his email pinged. It was a reply from Obsidian Dreamer. The message was brief, but unsettling. You should not have disturbed the site. The Buried Ones do not forgive trespassers. They remember. They call to those who've touched their domain. If you are hearing them now, it's already too late. Malcolm's blood ran cold. He responded with more questions, but the user never replied again. Weeks turned into months, and the manifestations in Malcolm's life grew more tangible. Electrical appliances flickered and failed without explanation. His dog, Max, a cheerful golden retriever who had been his companion for years, refused to stay in the house, barking incessantly at empty corners until Malcolm had no choice but to leave him with a friend. Even his neighbors began to notice something was wrong, commenting on the strange noises coming from his property late at night. A low, rhythmic hum, like the beating of a distant drum. Franklin greeted him with a mix of concern and wariness. "You look like you've seen a ghost," he said, ushering Malcolm inside. Malcolm wasted no time recounting everything. The nightmares, the hallucinations, the symbols in his home. Franklin listened intently, his expression growing darker with each word. When Malcolm finished, Franklin sighed and leaned back in his chair. "I've been doing some research of my own," Franklin said. "The symbols we found on that slab, they're part of an ancient binding ritual. Whoever created them wasn't just marking territory, they were imprisoning something. And we let it out." "What does that mean?" Malcolm asked, his voice trembling. "What did we let out?" Franklin hesitated before answering. "I don't know, but I've come across accounts of similar sites, places where the seals were broken. Every single one ended in disaster, entire villages disappearing overnight, cataclysmic events that defy explanation. If the Buried Ones are real, then disturbing their rest is catastrophic." Malcolm felt a chill creep down his spine. "What can I do? How do I fix this?" Franklin shook his head. "I don't think you can. If they've marked you, if they're calling to you, the best you can do is stay away from the site. Don't give them any more power." But Malcolm wasn't convinced that staying away would solve anything. The pull he felt, the whispers, the visions, they weren't tied to a location. They were inside him, a part of him now. Against Franklin's advice, Malcolm decided to return to the estate in Miami. He needed closure, a way to confront whatever had been unleashed. He reached out to a few members of his old team, hoping to convince someone to accompany him, but none of them wanted anything to do with the project. Alone and armed with only a flashlight, a crowbar, and a bag of supplies, Malcolm made his way back to the sprawling mansion. To his surprise, the estate was still under heavy security. Guards patrolled the perimeter, and the main house appeared occupied, its windows glowing softly in the night. Malcolm bypassed the main gates, sneaking through a gap in the fence he remembered from his time on the project. His heart raced as he approached the sealed entrance to the tunnels, now hidden beneath a thick layer of concrete and steel. It took hours to break through the barrier, but Malcolm was relentless. When the final chunk of concrete fell away, revealing the dark maw of the tunnel, he felt a strange sense of relief, as if the oppressive weight on his chest had momentarily lifted. He descended into the darkness, the air growing colder with each step. The tunnels were eerily silent, the echoes of his footsteps the only sound. Malcolm followed the path to the collapsed chamber, now little more than rubble. He climbed over the debris, his flashlight illuminating the jagged remains of the cavern. At the center, where the altar had stood, he saw something that made his breath catch. The symbols on the walls were glowing faintly, their light pulsing in time with the rhythmic hum that had haunted his dreams. And there, In the center of the rubble was a fissure in the ground, a narrow, jagged opening that seemed impossibly deep. From its depths came a sound Malcolm could only describe as breathing. As he approached the fissure, a wave of nausea washed over him. His vision blurred and the hum grew louder, resonating in his skull. He dropped to his knees, clutching his head as the whispers returned, louder and more insistent than ever. "Join us. You opened the way. You belong to us now." Malcolm fought to resist, his mind a battlefield of fear and determination. He reached into his bag, pulling out a small vial of gasoline and a lighter. If he couldn't seal the fissure, he would destroy it. He poured the gasoline into the crack, the pungent smell filling the air. But before he could ignite it, the ground beneath him began to tremble. A force unlike anything he'd ever felt threw him backward, slamming him into the cavern wall. The whispers turned into a deafening roar, and from the fissure emerged a form, amorphous, shifting, and impossibly large. It radiated malice, its presence a physical weight that pinned Malcolm to the ground. For a moment he thought it was the end, but then, from somewhere deep within himself, he found the strength to move. With trembling hands, he struck the lighter and tossed it toward the gasoline. The fire erupted, consuming the fissure and filling the cavern with smoke and flames. The entity shrieked, a sound that pierced Malcolm's soul. The cavern began to collapse, the walls crumbling as the ground gave way. Malcolm scrambled to his feet, running blindly through the tunnels as debris rained down around him. He emerged into the night, coughing and covered in soot. Behind him, the entrance to the tunnels caved in, sealing whatever lay below back into the earth. In the months that followed, Malcolm tried to rebuild his life. The visions and whispers subsided, though they never fully disappeared. He lived with the knowledge that he had come face to face with something beyond comprehension, something that could never be fully erased. The estate remained abandoned, a scar on the landscape and a reminder of what had been unleashed. Malcolm knew he would never return, but the memories would haunt him forever, a testament to the price of curiosity and the dangers of disturbing what should remain buried. Malcolm's escape from the collapsing cavern marked the end of the immediate danger, but it was far from the end of the nightmare. As he drove away from the estate that night, adrenaline coursing through his veins, he felt no relief. The flames he had ignited might have sealed the fissure temporarily, but deep down, Malcolm suspected that what he had encountered was far from vanquished. Back at his home in Atlanta, Malcolm tried to pick up the pieces of his shattered life. The physical scars from his narrow escape healed over time, but the mental and emotional wounds were far deeper. He found himself plagued by a constant sense of unease, as if the entity he had encountered had left an indelible mark on his very soul. The faint rhythmic hum he had heard in the tunnels continued to haunt him, sometimes so faint that he doubted his own senses, but always present enough to remind him of what he had unleashed. Sleep became an elusive luxury. Even on nights when he managed to drift off, his dreams were filled with incomprehensible shapes and sounds. He would wake drenched in sweat, the echoes of the cavern ringing in his ears. Often he found himself staring at the ceiling, his mind replaying the moment he had stood face to face with the entity. He couldn't shake the feeling that it had looked directly at him, into him, as if it had learned something about him that he didn't yet know himself. The weeks passed in a haze. Malcolm avoided his old colleagues, ignored calls from his family, and stayed away from public places. He became a recluse, retreating into his home with the blinds drawn and the doors locked. But the solitude offered little comfort. He began to notice strange occurrences around the house, objects moving from their usual places, the faint smell of damp earth lingering in the air, and shadows that seemed to shift when he wasn't looking directly at them. One evening, as Malcolm sat in his dimly lit living room nursing a glass of whiskey, the hum grew louder. This time it wasn't a faint sound in the distance, but a tangible vibration that seemed to emanate from the very walls of the house. The glass in his hand began to tremble, and the floor beneath his feet felt as though it might buckle. Panic gripped him as the lights flickered and then went out entirely, plunging the house into darkness. In the silence that followed, Malcolm heard something that made his blood run cold, a voice, low and guttural, speaking in a language he didn't understand. It seemed to come from all around him, as if the very air was alive with malevolence. He fumbled for the flashlight he kept on the coffee table, but when he turned it on, the beam of light illuminated something that shouldn't have been there. At the far end of the room stood a figure, its form indistinct and shrouded in shadow. It was tall and impossibly thin, its limbs elongated in unnatural proportions. Its face, or what Malcolm assumed was its face, was a blank void, as if it existed outside the realm of physical reality. For a moment, neither Malcolm nor the figure moved, and the silence between them was deafening. Then it spoke. Its voice was a cacophony of whispers, each word layered over the next in a chaotic symphony that made Malcolm's head throb. Though he couldn't understand the words, their intent was clear. This was no idle visitation. The entity had followed him, and it was here for a reason. Malcolm's survival instincts kicked in. He grabbed the nearest object, a heavy lamp, and hurled it at the figure. The lamp passed through the shadowy form as if it were made of mist, shattering against the wall behind it. The entity didn't react. Instead, it began to move toward him, its steps slow and deliberate. With every step it took, the air grew colder and the hum grew louder. Malcolm fled. He bolted out of the house and into the night, not stopping until he was several blocks away. When he finally turned back, he half expected to see his home engulfed in flames or consumed by darkness, but it stood there, silent and unassuming, as if nothing had happened. He didn't go back that night. Instead, he checked into a dingy motel on the outskirts of the city, using cash to avoid leaving a trace. As he sat on the edge of the bed, his hands trembling, he realized he couldn't keep running. Whatever this was, it wasn't tied to a place. It was tied to him. Determined to find answers, Malcolm reached out to Dr. Franklin Wade once more. Though he was reluctant at first, Franklin agreed to meet. The two men convened in a quiet corner of a university library, away from prying eyes and ears. Malcolm recounted everything he had experienced since their last meeting, the hum, the voice, the shadowy figure. Franklin listened intently, his face growing paler with every word. "This isn't just an attachment," Franklin said finally. "It's an invocation. Whatever you encountered in that cavern, it's latched onto you. You didn't just disturb its resting place. You became its beacon." "What does that mean?" Malcolm asked, his voice edged with desperation. "Can I get rid of it?" Franklin hesitated. "There are rituals, ancient ones, that claim to sever these kinds of connections, but they're dangerous, and there's no guarantee they'll work. Most of the accounts I've read, the outcomes aren't good." Malcolm leaned forward, his voice firm. "I don't care about the risks. Tell me what I need to do." The ritual was to take place in a remote stretch of forest far from civilization. Franklin had spent weeks researching the process, piecing together fragments from ancient texts and obscure sources. The goal was to create a barrier between Malcolm and the entity, using symbols, incantations, and a carefully constructed circle of protection. As they prepared the site, Malcolm felt a strange mix of hope and dread. The forest was eerily quiet, the only sounds the rustling of leaves and the occasional call of a distant bird. The circle was drawn in chalk, its intricate design filled with symbols that Franklin assured him would ward off malevolent forces. When night fell, the ritual began. Franklin stood at the edge of the circle, chanting in a language Malcolm didn't recognize. The air grew heavy, and the hum that had haunted Malcolm for months returned, louder than ever. It was as if the entity knew what they were trying to do and was fighting back. Malcolm knelt in the center of the circle, his eyes closed as Franklin's chants grew louder. The ground beneath him began to tremble, and the wind picked up, swirling around them with unnatural force. Shadows danced at the edge of the clearing, shapes that seemed to flicker in and out of existence. Then, without warning, the entity appeared. It emerged from the darkness, its form shifting and writhing like smoke. Its presence was overwhelming, a tide of malevolence that threatened to drown them both. Franklin's voice faltered, and for a moment Malcolm thought the ritual would fail. But then he felt it. A spark of defiance, a flicker of strength he hadn't known he possessed. He opened his eyes and stared directly at the entity, meeting its blank, featureless gaze. "You don't own me," Malcolm said, his voice steady despite the terror clawing at his chest. "You never did." The entity recoiled as if struck, its form flickering like a dying flame. Franklin seized the moment, his chants rising to a crescendo. The circle blazed with light, and the shadows at its edge vanished. The entity let out a final ear-piercing shriek before dissolving into the night. When it was over, the forest was silent once more. Malcolm collapsed to the ground, exhausted but alive. Franklin helped him to his feet, his expression a mix of relief and amazement. "You did it!" Franklin said. "You broke the connection." In the weeks that followed, Malcolm began to rebuild his life. The hum was gone, and the nightmares ceased. He sold his house and moved to a new city, determined to leave the past behind. Though the scars of his ordeal would never fully heal, he found solace in the knowledge that he had faced the darkness and survived. But even as he started anew, a small part of him remained vigilant, always watching for the faintest sign of the entity's return. Because while the connection was broken, he knew that some things could never truly be erased, and that the darkness he had encountered would always be waiting just beneath the surface. Though Malcolm had survived the ordeal, the experience left behind an indelible imprint on his psyche. He attempted to settle into his new life in Portland, Oregon, a city far removed from the sun-drenched opulence of Miami and the suffocating darkness of his former home in Atlanta. Portland's misty mornings and forested hills felt like a refuge, a place where he could bury himself in anonymity and start over. He took up woodworking, a craft he had dabbled in during his younger years, but had long abandoned in favor of the lucrative construction contracts that once defined his career. The rhythmic motion of sanding and carving wood became a source of solace, a quiet meditation that allowed him to focus on something tangible, something solid and real. Each finished piece, a chair, a table, a carved figure, felt like a small triumph over the chaos that had consumed his life. But even in this peaceful new setting, shadows lingered at the edges of his mind. Portland's rainy nights sometimes brought with them a familiar unease. Though the hum had ceased and the entity's presence seemed banished, Malcolm occasionally felt an inexplicable sense of being watched. On particularly foggy evenings, when the streets were quiet and the city felt like a ghost town, he would catch himself glancing over his shoulder, half expecting to see the angular figure standing in the distance. To cope, Malcolm began keeping a journal. Every night he wrote down his thoughts, fears, and memories, hoping that putting them to paper might exorcise the lingering dread. His entries often veered into the philosophical, questions about the nature of the entity he had encountered, and whether it was truly gone or simply waiting for another opportunity to emerge. He also documented the fragments of the ritual that Franklin had performed, sketching the protective symbols and recording the chants as best he could remember. Part of him feared that he might one day need this knowledge again. The city's libraries and bookstores became a second home for Malcolm. He buried himself in research, seeking any information that might shed light on what had happened. He delved into obscure folklore, ancient religions, and esoteric texts, hoping to piece together a clearer picture of the buried ones and their significance. What he found was both fascinating and disturbing. The buried ones, he discovered, were not a singular entity but a pantheon of ancient forces, each associated with a different aspect of existence: death, time, decay, and memory. They were said to be remnants of a primordial age, predating human civilization, and their power was rooted in the subconscious fears of those who unwittingly invoked them. Some texts suggested that they could never be destroyed, only contained or appeased. Malcolm's survival had not been a victory over the entity, but a temporary reprieve. One day, while browsing a dusty secondhand bookstore, Malcolm came across an old leather-bound tome titled Echoes of the Deep. The book, written in a mix of archaic languages and cryptic symbols, seemed to reference the same motifs he had encountered in the tunnels. Among its pages, he found a chilling passage: "The buried ones are patient. Time is irrelevant to those who dwell beneath the earth. When disturbed, they do not seek vengeance, but reclamation. What is taken from them, they will always attempt to retrieve." Malcolm closed the book, his hands trembling. He couldn't help but wonder if his reprieve was only temporary, for now the silence in his mind was a blessing, but he knew better than to believe it would last forever. The buried ones had been awakened once, and though he had survived, Malcolm suspected that his name would remain etched in their memory, a faint echo in the deep, and echoes he knew could always return. If you like this video, please give it a like and subscribe to our channel. Also, leave your comments below and tell us, what are your thoughts on Diddy having secret tunnels? Why might he need them? We want to hear from you. Thank you for watching and see you next time.